Test.
Okay.
Okay. Great.
Just remember close.
So that's your own personal one here, is that it?
Are we,
Oh, okay.
It's just because
is the live stream good?
shaky hand.
Stream? Great. All right, well, thank you all for coming out and welcome to our third session of our conversation series for the African American Digital Humanities program for this semester. We are very fortunate today to be in the presence of such a wonderful panel, having a very important conversation about Black joy in the arts and humanities. So for those who come to our conversation series regularly, you'll notice that I am not the one who's supposed to be moderating these. It's clearly supposed to be Dr. Bickerstaff, who does such a phenomenal job, but she's going to share some of her brilliance in terms of her own work and writing with us today. And so I am going to step in and try to do my best to do what she does regularly. Just for those who are new to joining AADHum programming, the African American Digital Humanities program is a College of Arts and Humanities program that's aimed at the intersection of digital humanities and African American history and culture. We are trying to foster the next generation of scholars and scholarship through training, through facilitation, and through creating a community around important conversations in this intersection. So we thank you for joining us. We also remind you that as a part of AADHum programming, we regularly host what's called our DH Incubator session in collaboration with Myth. Our next incubator training session is focused on social movements and begins following spring break. Feel free to check our website, AADHum.umd.edu for all of our events that are upcoming and staying in touch and in contact with us. So I'm going to start by introducing our panel, and then we'll get right into it and have hopefully a nice productive conversation today. First, joining me to my left is Dr. Javon Bickerstaff. Dr. Bickerstaff is a relationship coach and a scholar of gender, race, and emotions who researches emotion strategies couples co-construct to foster emotional intimacy. She navigates differences and cultivates shared identity. Centering Black couples and theorizing from their experience, her first book project, Living with the Lights On, Willing Apprenticeship in the Craft of Building Shared Lives, integrates recent developments in gender studies, sociology, and psychology to propose novel, actionable frames for grappling with modern relationship tensions. Conceptualizing Black relationships beyond claims of crisis, it attends to expressions of care and wellness to offer a rare window into Black intimate lives. She's currently a postdoctoral associate for the AADHum Initiative here at the University of Maryland, is a former Ford and Fulbright Fellow, and is a proud alumna of MIT, where she earned degrees in creative writing, urban studies, and received her PhD in sociology from Harvard University. Please welcome Javon Bickerstaff. Sitting immediately to her left is Professor Curley Holton, who is the executive director of this David C. Driscoll Center here at the University of Maryland. And we thank the David C. Driscoll Center for welcoming us and allowing us the privilege of hosting this conversation series here. I ask you to take some time and take in the setting if you've not been to the Driscoll Center before. Professor Holton is also the David M. and Linda Roth Professor of Art Emeritus at Lafayette College and the founding director of the Experimental Printmaking Institute. Holton is a printmaker and painter whose work has been exhibited professionally for over 25 years in over 31 in-person shows. His work is held in numerous private and public collections, including the Cleveland Museum of Art, Yale University Art Gallery, Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, the National Gallery of Art. His exhibitions have included numerous national and international venues, such as Egypt's 7th International Biennale and Cleveland Museum of Art and the Whitney Museum of American Art. Professor Holton has written numerous articles and essays on art and artists and presented over 70 public lectures on the subjects of his work, African American art and contemporary printmaking. Please join me in welcoming Professor Holton. And at the end of our table is Dr. Lamar Darrell Bruce, who is an interdisciplinary humanities scholar, critical theorist, Afromanticist, and an assistant professor of American Studies and affiliate faculty in African American Studies, Theater and Performance Studies, and Women's Studies here at the University of Maryland. Much of his scholarship concerns Blackness and feeling, that is, the phenomenological, affective, erotic textures of Black life across the diaspora, and how these inflect Black expressive culture. Dr. Bruce is currently completing his first book project, How to Go Mad Without Losing Your Mind, Madness and Black Radical Creativity, which is a study of Black artists who mobilize madness in radical literature and performance. More broadly, he writes about and teaches about Africana literature and performance, global pop culture, disability studies, queer theory, psychoanalysis, and the art and aesthetics of quotidian Black life. Winner of the 2014 Joe Wexelman Award for African American Review, Dr. Bruce has had work featured or forthcoming in American Quarterly, No Tea, No Shade, New Writings in Black Queer Studies, Oxford Bibliographies, and in African American Studies and in the Drama Review. Please join me in welcoming our final panelist, Dr. Lamar Bruce. So I'd like us to dive in thinking about this notion of Black joy in a couple of ways. By way of introductions, maybe each of you could spend a few moments just sharing with us your thoughts on what do we mean as we begin the conversation of Black joy? Is this different than joy without the Black in quotations beforehand? Is it seen as engaged in other ways as being a part of Black joy? Maybe you can begin by framing your own work in the context of Black joy as a part of a larger examination of expressive culture and feelings and the full humanity of Blackness. Whoever wants to get us started.
Well, I can start if you like. From the perspective as a visual artist, can you hear me okay? There was an exhibition in the 1970s called Free Within Ourselves, and it was a survey of African American art. And it was based on the premise that in the face of social restrictions and limitations and the history of segregation and racism, that the practice of making art had a real direct connection to this notion that I could liberate myself in a work of art or in the privacy of a studio. And when I think about joy, this notion of Black joy, it has to be culturally contextualized for me. And that the notion of joy, from my perspective, is when one can actualize themselves. Now, actualizing oneself is very idiosyncratic, what makes me feel as though I've achieved something. Now, this is really, I think, for the African American, this notion of Black joy is impacted by the way in which people of color have been socialized, both publicly and privately. The permission, self-permission to actualize oneself. There's a statement by the artist Emma Amos who stated every time she goes in the studio, it's an act of political protest. The mere choice and belief that she can make a mark on a canvas, a blank canvas that had authority and a certain kind of self-confidence and agency. The very act of doing that with a legacy of enslavement brings profound joy, which is of course different than pleasure. So I think there are things that are very unique about the Black experience that defines this and helps negotiate this. Now, it's not absolute because I think we all now agree that there's no sort of monolithic sense of Blackness, that it gets negotiated, gets hybrid. Notion of Black joy in a North American, African American person versus someone from the Caribbean could be quite different. So you can't make an assumption. But I think if I had to generalize it, it is a response to the ability to self-actualize oneself, to achieve a task, which brings about a certain kind of warm wash over the brain, which produces a sense of joy. And I think it can be connected to others. For example, if one is holding a grandchild and someone else is holding a grandchild, there's a shared kind of affection that we can all agree on. And I'm going to close by describing an event that happened to me recently, because I've thought about a lot of events that would help define this. I was sitting in a restaurant a few weeks ago with my wife, and across from me I recognized a couple who were white, and I recognized a gentleman from my former college, Lafayette College. I wasn't sure which department he worked in, but I did recognize his face. And he looked at me and he acknowledged that he recognized me. And I couldn't decide whether he was a faculty member or administrator. When he got up, he walked over to me and said, "I just want to let you know, we've adopted a Black child, and I love her so much." Now, my wife thought this was the weirdest thing that happened. But I understood, I mean, I found it uncomfortable and kind of racist, but I knew what he was trying to say to me. And my response to him was that I'm glad your heart is that large that you can love a child different than you. But he was trying to get my sort of approval that this child had met some sort of standard to be loved by this white family. So, you know, it's a strange kind of thing. So there's a moment that we celebrate the love of a child or an offspring or a grandchild, but this was a little different. There has some gaps in this shared celebration going on. So again, I just want to say that the Black experience produces some unique sort of definitions of joy. For example, humor. We know humor is culturally specific. What makes one group laugh, the other group just doesn't get. We see this all the time. So I think joy it can be placed in a location as well.
I'm delighted to be here. I tend to think of joy as both emotion and motion. Joy as feeling and doing. I think about joy as a sort of exuberant, effervescent intensity of good feeling, right? That fundamentally radiates, emanates, right? It's energetic, it's active. And inasmuch as joy is radiant, exuberant, effervescent feeling, inasmuch as it's active and energetic, it can be harnessed, it can be mobilized, it can be instrumentalized toward various aims, right? I'm thinking about sort of mobilizing joy within the process of Black resistance, Black liberation, right? I'm at work on two books. The latter is called The Afromantic, and it unfurls a cultural history of Black joy, a critical theory of Black joy, and an aesthetic expression of Black joy in the midst of anti-Blackness, right? I want to traverse, beginning with descriptions of the joy of emancipation, right? As articulated by recently emancipated Black people in the late 19th century, as manifested in folk tales and WPA narratives and song and self-writing. And I want to sort of traverse Black religiosity, Black literature, Black humor, Black sex, Black quotidian life. But here's what's really critically important about the project that I have in mind. Beyond unfurling this sort of cultural history of Black joy and critical theory of Black joy, I want to generate a work of scholarship that is a source of Black joy, that actually emanates Black joy, right, into the consciousness, into the mind, into the spirit of the reader, right? So I am invested in critically doing Black joy. It's not enough to simply describe it. I want to do it. I want to actually create a book that is an aesthetic and affective object, right, that sort of really potently performs that emanation, that radiance that I've just described. Black joy in the West is always happening under duress, right? So any explanation of, any description of Black joy has to think critically about the sort of existential perils that would threaten Black joy or that would co-opt Black joy for sort of various insidious aims. I'm thinking about, for example, Saidiya Hartman's description of the coffle, the auction block, where enslaved Black people were compelled to perform what she calls simulated jollity, right? So there we have this feigned joy mobilized within a project of anti-Blackness, right? So we have to always be critically aware of the sort of anti-Blackness that imperils, right, Black joy, and against which Black joy might mobilize itself. I'll leave it there for now.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am clearly more comfortable on that side of the table than I am on this side, so I'm struggling a bit already. All right, we're in solidarity with that. Thinking about this whole notion of Black joy, I think, has been a bigger challenge for me. And I use the air quotes of Black around joy very intentionally, because I struggle with notions that joy need be qualitatively different in any kind of particular way, given the fact that everything is contextualized by culture, right? By conditions, material, emotional, psychological. That is the case for all humans walking on this earth. And so when I was kind of thinking about what we mean by Black joy, clearly there are conditions that situate us in particular power dynamics, in particular struggles. But when I think about notions of joy, I think about it in terms of Black people, and I think it's easier for me to think about that, thinking about joy in terms of Black people. And when I do that, I think of joy as being the existence and the demonstration and the embodiment of the fullness of humanity, right? I think that I see this in particular as a sociologist, and sociologists are prone to study problems and crisis and things that fall apart. But the human condition is never just crisis and problems and things that fall apart, even though in the way that it's studied for us, that is often the focus. And so when I think about joy, I think about it as a condition in which people are exhibiting the fullness of their humanity in spite of and in the midst of all of the conditions that set the context for our experience. It kind of reminds me of that, that Shirley Caesar gospel song, This Is Joy, and it's this joy the world didn't give it and the world can't take it away. So whatever the conditions happen to be, the notion that joy would be absent is problematic. And so as a sociologist thinking about that, I think about joy, I think about my work when it comes to love and loving in that context. Well, of course we love, well, of course we experience joy. That's human. And so the notion that we wouldn't, right, or the notion that there would be less of because of conditions, clearly is fallacious, right? And so really for me, I think about this notion of joy in the context, even less than of being an emotion or feeling, but as a state and condition of humanity, full stop.
So what I've heard from all three of you today is this conversation about Black joy and its relationship to ideas like duress or agency or our full humanity. It reminds me of a Twitter thread by activist writer Brittany Paquinette, who wrote about resistance and joy. And the thread followed that because of the condition of Blackness under duress in society, that our very existence is resistance, that our love is resistance, and that our joy is resistance. Dr. Bickerstaff, you talk about this in terms of strategies for long-term relationships. I've heard you allude to this notion of Black love as being resistant and resilient. Black joy and Black love, these are ideas often replaced in popular culture with notions, as you've mentioned, of deviance and of problem. But what I would love to hear about is your understanding of the relationship between this notion of joy, of Black joy, and resistance. What is gained by pairing these ideas together, potentially even what might be lost in that combination of the two?
Now, I often sort of deploy the term resistance and think through sort of various sort of Black expressive cultural forms as manifesting and performing resistance, but I think that there are critical languages, critical processes beyond resistance that we have to keep in mind, right? Black joy is creative. It doesn't merely resist, it originates, right? It's not merely sort of mobilized in or sort of generated in response to the fact of anti-Blackness, right? It precedes, exceeds anti-Blackness, right? And the Black joy that I experience and the Black joy that I'm interested in sort of proliferating in the world, right, is not beholden to, not bound to, right, not ancillary around anti-Blackness.
Yeah.
So resistance is a useful terminology because we are constantly under duress, because there are myriad oppressive forces imperiling us, and yet, right, we have to hold the notion of resistance and the paradigm of resistance in hand, and yet we have to think through sort of what bursts beyond that, right? The exuberance that can't be contained within that particular frame.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Sometimes, and I agree with you, sometimes we find this alternative possibility or this broader possibility in foreign environments when we're outside of our common environment because we inherit so much information for that. I'm going to give you two examples. One about joy and how the other side of joy can be expressed. When Jack Johnson won the heavyweight championship, whites gave him a title that was called Bad Nigger. That was a compliment because they were not, you couldn't mess with Jack Johnson because, you know, he wasn't frightened of a white man. This was at a time when everyone was supposed to be frightened of just the presence of a white male. When he won that championship, there was celebration throughout Harlem. Great celebration, great joy. In reaction to this joy, the police department interpreted this joy as a riot and a threat and began to attack these African Americans in that community with billy clubs, and some were killed in reaction to their expression of joy, which was not allowed. And I see contemporary expressions of this in different ways, but it was so clear to me when hip-hop and breakdancing was operating in such a confined space. It was almost like Jim Crow. You could only move yourself within a certain kind of subscribed space. Our movements could not be extended very far because they were perceived to be threatening. So the containment of the body, the black body, was so restricted. It was sort of striking that this had happened. And so I'm saying you see evidence of it in many ways in which one behaves. In a personal experience, my oldest son adopted Islamic faith. And he began to treat his female partner, differently. Very oppressive. She had to defer to him constantly and behave in a certain way that me and my wife and family found objectionable. We didn't believe that is the way that one should treat a partner or a female. It became so difficult that he had to leave. We asked him to leave our family in a way because it was just unacceptable. And I interrupted in some of their behavior on a number of occasions. And we haven't spoken in the last 2 years because of this. But it was completely unacceptable. But for him, it was joyful. And from our perspective, it's because that joy was based on the feeding of a very weak ego. No one needs to oppress anyone unless their ego is so fragile that they need that reaffirmation. We see this now happening all the time, and I'm not going to get into that, but we see this now. I mean, for the president to call Maxine Waters, describe her as having low IQ on national television, and we know what that means when he says low IQ. It's race-based, as soon as you say it, because the meaning of low IQ, after he's been called a moron by his Secretary of State, is coded. Low IQ is assigned to people of color. Their brain is supposed to be smaller, and their forehead is supposed to be larger, all that stuff. So it's coded, and he's sending a message. But what I'm trying to suggest to you is there are ways in which people that actualize themselves, attempt to, are restrained constantly because it goes into a territory of full liberation and full actualization. So this idea of joy can be dysfunctional and distorted because of these kind of conditions. It doesn't have to be race, it can be within a family setting, it can be very different. So I'm connecting to what he's saying, in that there's a sense of humanity that sometimes even what you find with other countries where there are people of color, you find other ways of expressing one's humanity in a fuller way. So sometimes the context of Black joy is very much North American.
I think this notion of joy as resistance or loving as resistance operates on kind of two levels for me. Thinking about it as an aim, I get uncomfortable, right? That what I am doing is performative, what I am doing is intended to resist via my joy, via my love. I get very uncomfortable with that notion. But I do think at the same time that the very existence of joy from people who are not supposed to feel joy, the existence of loving and relationships that empower and that fulfill and that make glad is resistant in outcome within the context of a society in a world that tends not to expect that.
And not so conscious, not so conscious.
Right, so exactly. I'm existing,
Yes.
I'm loving,
It's
I'm
coming
feeling
more
joy.
that place.
In doing that, because it's not expected, it is resistant to conditions that, right?
To have permission.
Right?
To give yourself permission.
To give myself permission or to be totally lacking in deference to the notion that I wouldn't have permission, right? The indifference to the notion, oh, are you kidding me? Like, to feel like unbound and unbossed by the notion that I wouldn't. And there's a way in which, you brought up Brittany Packnett. And so in the blog that I initially wrote for AADHum, I thought about her notion of we have to battle and build, right? I think that in the context of anti-Blackness, we can be subsumed and immersed in this notion that we are oppressed and there are conditions and all that is never not true, right? And yet, I don't wake up in the morning thinking about that. I wake up in the morning sometimes thinking, oh, my baby just called me, my niece just called me, and she's, hey, Joe, are you up yet? And she knows that Auntie is not up yet because I'm Joe, and I don't get up in the mornings, right? And yet, knowing that she's already thinking of me, joy and love, right? Like, I am not always consumed by the conditions that this society would want us to think that we're consumed
But
by.
there are class-based issues also.
Always.
Joy is tied to class, too. What one is taught as an expectation. They did a study once of kids. I read this in the book Blink. I can't think of the author right now.
Malcolm
Yeah.
Gladwell.
Yeah, Gladwell. And they took children, they interviewed children, and they discovered that children that were especially from minority families would go into a doctor's office and wait to be told what to do. And when they met with the doctor would have to spend a great deal of time asking them questions and to find out what their feeling was going on. And they used a comparison of a white child from an upper middle class family who would go into the doctor's office and tell the doctor exactly what is going on and what they expected from the doctor. So there's class issues also about expectation, about what is yours to have,
Right.
what privileges you have, and what you should expect from the world that is also joyful. And I find that people that are impoverished often are not only impoverished economically, but often are impoverished spiritually and emotionally because of that environment. I'm gonna give you a case so you can see this. And Jovan knows my wife and this research she's done about long-term Black relationships. When I met my wife, I knew she came from a very different class and economic experience than I had came from. I came from a working class family, blue collar, very stable homeowners. She came from an environment of abject poverty, powdered milk, powdered eggs, moving from apartment to apartment, especially when the rent was due and the mother didn't want to sleep with the landlord to pay the rent. It was really a bad situation, very bad. So she became very highly educated, very successful. And when I met her, I noticed, after we got kind of acquainted, that she had a lot of things in her bathroom, a lot of stuff. I came from an experience with a mother who was very sparse, not as accessory things. You put your shoes in a certain place, your bed was made a certain way. She was very Southern, but very kind of practical. I love that about her, and I inherited that. It's benefited me quite well. But to get back to the point, she had like bottle after bottles of lotion and hair stuff and perfumes just stacked in the cabinets. And I said, well, why would a person need more than one bottle of shampoo? And I paid attention to this, and I realized that the reason she was so successful and so motivated to achieve a certain income level so she could buy all the things that she could not get when she was a child. So that comes from a sort of psychology of lack. And the joy was to be able to go into that market and buy 6 bottles of shampoo, the freedom that she had never had. For me, I spent all the time getting rid of it. She spent all the time reacquiring it.
And all the tensions.
Let me ask a question that I think might link this.
You understand what I mean about class and economics.
I want to link this back to something that you mentioned when we were talking about the discomfort you had with joy as the goal rather than the end result. So I want to think about the manifestations of Black joy versus a practice of joy or a performance of joy, because that's what I'm hearing a little bit as well. Andre Brock has recently written about joy in Black digital practice to try to move away from this notion of resistance as the ultimate way that we talk about how Black folks experience the digital space, and instead talks about the libidinal economy and the pleasure and the desire and the joy of being Black and being surrounded in Blackness, and that not being necessarily of a performative nature. But I'd like for you to think about and talk to us about how we situate joy in our work. Is it as a tool? Is it a state of being? Is it a facet of one's identity? Or is it something else? Alternately, what does it mean to practice or perform joy as a display of Blackness, as you all have been thinking through it so far?
I think you have to learn that. If you're going to make it a part of your practice as an individual, where you each day, that's an important part of your expression and your work. I think you have to learn that if you didn't witness that as a child. I think that's very important. So that you engage it on a level that it celebrates who you are. I think that's important.
Thinking about Curly's comments about class, I think that having to learn it in the notion that you kind of just explained it brings me to this idea of the practice of kind of liberation, right? There are certain things that certain folks feel entitled to and never question the fact that they feel entitled to, right? And I think that in that sense, I don't know that joy is a tool or even an outcome or an aim. I think it becomes an embodied experience, right? An embodied praxis. I don't know that everyone is taught it in an explicit manner, because I think some people are in the water that kind of reinforces the idea, well, of course, you should have this and feel this. But I think when we have to make it explicit, right, via the conditions, and clearly that is not something that is particular or unique to Black people. Anytime you are in conditions that are meant to undermine and to kind of disentangle your sense of your full humanity, I think you're gonna come into that challenge.
I think joy is all of the above, yeah? It's a sensation, it's a force, right? It's a tool, it's a phenomenology, yeah? It's a sort of cosmic process, right? That sometimes we can deliberately sort of mobilize and harness, and sometimes it overtakes and overwhelms us and erupts. I used the language of radiance earlier, exuberance and radiance, and I want to think about joy that erupts, right? Beyond simple radiance, eruptions of joy. I'm fascinated and thinking recently about writing about Black joy in public, Black joy outdoors, right? In our public sphere, over the past 5 years in particular, we've seen so many examples of Black death, Black pain, Black grief in public, outdoors. I'm actually in the process of putting together a research proposal to visit outdoor festivals and carnival and other bacchanals to just witness and participate in and do Black joy under open sky in public that erupts into the ether and into infinity, right? But the language of eruption is useful for me in particular because it suggests that which is sometimes that overtakes us, that is beyond our control. And I'm fine and actually thrilled with the joy that sometimes overtakes me, right? That is precisely the opposite of what we were describing earlier, that which requires permission or that which is sort of subject to, limited by, constricted by the situation of our upbringing or our socialization. Sometimes there's something else. And we can, again, I used the language of cosmic a moment ago, we can bring spirit into the room, right? That just absolutely bursts the boundaries, the borders, that, you know, some psychoanalysts use this term jouissance for the joy that is, the ecstatic joy that overtakes us.
I'm fascinated by this notion of the eruption and the inability to harness joy in some capacity as someone who studies the digital. And I wonder if you all could ponder this with me for a bit, because this idea of experiencing joy in public and in this space that's surrounded by others, what does that look like when we are restricted by the notions of platform and affordances of a space that are not a physical space, but are in essence a digital or a virtual space? And the eruptions of Black joy online, do these manifest in different ways? Are we consistently then restricted by the affordances of the platform and beholden to what is possible in that space? Can we not then experience the fullness of Black joy given those parameters?
So I've been thinking about that. This is part of my job, to think about the digital, and everybody on the team knows I'm the analog person on our team. And so I've been thinking about how joy manifests itself when I think about myself being situated within Black community. And the things that come to mind are like the kind of collective effervescence that happens in church. I struggle with being a part of, I'm an introvert, with big groups. And so I struggle with church sometimes, and yet there is something about being in church, and when you hit that moment where the organ starts to play and the preacher starts to pontificate and wax on, and everybody starts to speak back, yes, amen, preach, doc. You know, there are those moments that we have. And so I think about that as the kind of, that is like the everyday feeling that comes to mind for me. But I know that that also happens in the midst of moments that seem like they shouldn't be. So like a Black repast is a joyous occasion, right? We have just mourned someone, but we celebrate the connections that we have. We celebrate the life that we've lost, but also the life that they had with us. Some of my most fun times with my family, ironically, have been post-funeral, right? Because there's a certain type of laughter and joy that happens in those moments. And so thinking about how that kind of translates into the digital space and digital platform, I think for me the first time that came to a head was right after Michael Jackson died. When Michael Jackson died in 2009, he died on the 25th, and I know that because my birthday is the 26th. And there was a sense of collective mourning that I couldn't be a part of because I was in Paris, right? And it's not that I don't know folks in Paris who would mourn with me. Most of the folks that I know are Black French folks, and so they were mourning too. But I wasn't at home. I couldn't experience it the same way. But there was the BET Awards and there was the Facebook, right? And on Facebook, watching all of my friends engage with some of the ratchetness that was unfolding during the BET Awards as they were quickly trying to memorialize Michael Jackson. Being able to laugh with people and hear the kinds of things that they were saying. I think that we engage in it differently now via the Twitters, right? I tend to watch after things have happened. I tend not to be engaged in the conversation as it happens, but I think that we, in these digital platforms, I don't know if it's replicating, I don't know if it's qualitatively different, but the sense that I felt watching everyone talk about the passing of Michael Jackson and the BET Awards and how they were trying to meld the two, often unsuccessfully, online made me feel a sense of community and home. So I don't know if there are qualitative differences. I don't know enough to know. But what I do know is that it can contain and allow for some of that same kind of collective effervescence.
And I mean, social media, digital platforms, right, facilitate virality, right? Thinking about viral joy. It's fascinating. My Facebook feed at one point relatively recently became what I describe as a sort of loop of spectacles of Black death, right? Lots of videos and images of Black death constantly flowing through the feed. And I took to posting images of happy Black babies.
Yes.
And there's actually a Twitter account devoted to images and videos of happy Black babies. And there was this one moment in which I posted a story of, again, some spectacle of Black death by way of police violence. And then immediately afterward, I posted the little Black girl, maybe 2 to 3 years old, standing in front of the mirror, declaring to herself that she's gorgeous, right? And I'm invested in, so the second book is called The Afromantic, right? Afromanticism, and I'm still working out how I formulate it, but this is the little statement that I have. It's an existential attitude, aesthetic commitment, affective mode, and ideological formation that is bound to deep sorrow, honoring the grief that often attends Black life in the West, and is driven by ecstatic feeling and utopic dreaming, right? It's bound to sorrow even as it's driven toward utopic dreaming and ecstatic feeling. The open to the second book as I currently envision it, it begins with the sound of my niece's laughter. A sort of response to Frederick Douglass's 1845 narrative. You know, his aunt's screams sort of announce his abjection, we were talking about abjection, and kind of usher him through the bloodstained gates. I'm thinking through what my niece's laughter does. My niece's laughter as a theoretical intervention, as a rally cry, as a world-making event. And it's fascinating to think about Frederick Douglass's aunt. So I'm thinking about female kin, not in the direct line. My niece, female kin, thinking about gender and kinship. But if we're going to think critically through the fact of Black life in the West, we have to. Our score has to include the anguished screams of Aunt Hester and the sort of, I should say, the unspeakably grievous experience that Aunt Hester underwent, and the unspeakable joy that my niece, praise God, accesses. Those sounds have to both be incorporated into our score when thinking through Black life. So the spectacles of anti-Black police violence, the little girl looking in the mirror staring at herself. Facebook, social media permits both of those things. Aunt Hester's scream, my niece's laughter. We have to do honor to the fact of this sorrow, even as we sort of pursue a sort of radical, joyful possibility.
Let me build on that. I love this notion of viral joy. I know exactly the framework you're talking about, of the carefree Black children in response to the death. Jessica Liu has written about this as well, about this idea of responsiveness in some way to the death that's presented to us with this unencumbered joy. I wonder if we can shift our ideas to thinking a little bit about diaspora. I know it sounds like a shift, but bear with me. Because all of us have talked about this notion of joy that resonates so deeply within the Black experience. And I'm wondering if we can consider for a bit of time a little bit more about diasporic Blackness and diasporic Black joy. Dr. Bruce, you recently wrote in your piece, Mad as a Place, in American Quarterly, African captives accessed what Spillers calls a richness of possibility and realized diasporic mobility, sociality, kinship, creativity, and modes of being that endure even now in their marvelously tenacious airs. In a fruitless expanse, the enslaved bore fruit. After all, I wonder if we can talk about joy as part of that fruit that they bore after all, and whether this notion of diasporic Black joy is useful for scholars and for artists in conceptualizing the lived experience of Blackness that is distinct and worthy of inquiry and worthy of expression and creativity.
Well, you know, survival is a strategy too. It's a mechanism, you know, act of resistance. There's a great saying in West Africa, and I thought about this. When sorrow is shared, sorrow is lessened. When joy is shared, joy is increased. So this ideal of digital media and digital access can broaden a community and share value and find individuals that have common experience that otherwise you wouldn't have networked to. So it's an interesting way to bridge that and also transcend national boundaries. In terms of diaspora, there's a lot to overcome because of so many different notions of one's experience to the diaspora. If you traveled through it and looked at notions of Blackness and how the history of enslavement and the impact of that has impacted each locale, you see a range of dramatically different events and also fantasies about the events. And those fantasies can be extremely dysfunctional, but I understand as a mechanism, they're a mechanism of survival. For example, I spent a great deal of time in Jamaica and researching, and it was clear to me that this whole notion of be happy and this joy in that island required that you set aside any difference and any reference to colonial history. You had to create a new kind of reality so you could exist, so you could coexist. It was an agreed upon mechanism for the collective to survive. But at the same time, you had the browning of Jamaica, where the desire was dark Jamaicans marrying fair-skinned Jamaicans or white Jamaicans so that they could produce a brown baby rather than a Black baby. And you can go back to colonial history and slave journals, and you can see where an encounter with the West, especially Canadians with the West Indies, the Canadians were used to produce fair-skinned babies. So this was strategic. So what was joy? Joy was not to have the burden or the negative assignment of Blackness. So that's why I have these ambiguity about the whole notion of Blackness, because it doesn't always liberate you. It can also imprison you. And it can't be, you have to be very careful about making it a universal perspective. So my point is that the notion of identity is so diverse in the Caribbean. I had a student assistant who was sitting at my office desk. I had to go to the missions. I came back and I announced to her, she's Jamaican, parents are Jamaican, she's born in the US, living in Brooklyn. I introduced to her the notion that she was documented and recorded at the college as a Native African American and not as a West Indian. She was so outraged. How could I be identified as an African American? I said, now I'm African American, so be careful what you say now.
All right.
But for her, it was so important not to be assigned to that group of negative associations that were pretty much deposited by encounters with white America, not the white colonials and occupiers in the Caribbean, which is a totally different kind of experience with slavery. But my point is finding some kind of common element about joy is a difficult task, but you can ask. What intrigued me about this entire event is the notion that you could list a number of words like joy, love, pleasure, long list, and then just have people respond to that word and to see how different groups actually respond to the same word. And I don't know if that's been done yet, but I think it would be intriguing to see how cultural, racial, Geographical references have something to do with the notion of the meaning of that word. Could you imagine a group who have been taught the lesson that they don't have permission to be happy, to have grown up in a family that has that same message? You don't deserve to be happy. We're not happy. I'm not happy. Why do you think you could be happy? You know, it's a strange message, but it does exist in some families because it's too threatening to be happy. So you got to unpack a lot.
So I keep kind of returning to this metaphysics of joy, so to speak, which I've described as exuberant, radiant, eruptive. And if that quality holds true, if joy doesn't want to be bounded, if it's one of its fundamental properties, fundamental qualities is its desire, its tendency, its propensity to sort of move beyond bounds and spread, virality, contagion, right? Then it doesn't necessarily respect national boundaries and borders. A few moments ago, I talked about joy not necessarily respecting boundaries and borders as far as the sort of subject. But we can think about that as far as the sort of notion of nation or ocean for that matter, right? This sort of black joy in public and black joy outdoors, which will involve, again, visiting festivals, carnivals, tent revivals, right? All of those are such fundamentally and wonderfully diasporic spaces, right? In any given moment, and when we think about the sort of history of those socialities, the carnival, the music festival, the tent revival, right? And actually, Javon, I'm grateful to you because as you were talking, you were making it clear to me that I need to add emphatically tent revival to my list of the Black Joy Outdoors. And tent revival as distinct from church. Overlapping critically, of course, but for my purposes, the outdoor piece is critically important too. But in any event, my point here is that when I fling up my joyful laughter into the sky, right? It echoes in ways that sort of hopefully escape the limitations of national geopolitical borders. And that's the type of joy that I'm interested in attempting to harness when I can, because sometimes, again, I can't. Sometimes it's messy and wonderfully messy. So I'm thinking about a joy that is fundamentally diasporic in as much as it doesn't respect geopolitical boundaries and interdisciplinary, because I have to follow the joy where it goes.
Yes.
If the joy starts on the page of an Ellison novel or a Morrison novel, but it has a fundamentally musical inflection, I have to listen to that Louis Armstrong cut. I have to follow the joy. And if it generates in me a racing of my heart, right? If it gets my palms sweating, right? If it activates those other senses and sensations in me, I have to acknowledge that. So joy demands a sort of interdisciplinarity and a diasporic orientation, among other things.
Well, I get excited when we talk about interdisciplinarity, and I want to leave us ample time for questions. I do want to ask kind of a concluding question, and I don't mean for you to finish quickly, but I do mean for us to think about this for a bit. And it's about this idea of interdisciplinarity. I mean, if we think about the panel that we've assembled for today, right? We have a writer, scholar, relationship coach trained in sociology whose work focuses on Black love, right? An interdisciplinary scholar, an Afromanticist. We have a printmaker, a painter, an artist, scholar, educator. All of you break disciplinary boundaries with your work. All of you create work that resonates inside and outside of the academy. All of your work is informed by art and humanities and research and culture and history. And so what does this tell us more broadly about this examination of joy and what these disciplinary boundaries kind of limit us in terms of our inquiry? I hope that you can tell us about what this interdisciplinary work is possible for the rest of us who are interested in this study. And further, if you wouldn't mind, connecting it back to this notion of digital and the digital humanities for us, what might you imagine is missing then if we are bound up in our disciplines as we study joy online, as we study Black joy or diasporic joy? joy, and tell us a little bit about what your work together or what your interdisciplinary work can shed as lesson for us.
In my case, the interdisciplinary work is based upon a shared value within that group when we encounter each other from different disciplines and we collaborate. And collaboration is very important to me because it allows you to be more than what you are on your own. It creates something that's larger. But it requires that you are open to the influence of others and that they're confident and comfortable being willing to also share their perspective, their experience, and their knowledge and not be threatened by yours. And I've witnessed individuals that are threatened by it, others that are enriched by it and activated by it. So I think that the thing that is most, essential to this is a sense of personal confidence when you practice, a sense of confidence and self-approval to engage in these areas. I curate shows, for example, but I don't call myself a curator. I know individuals who have curated far less shows and far less important shows, but it's very important to them to call themselves curator. It's not necessary for me to validate myself that way. When I first came to Maryland, I asked that my appointment be in the art department and that I not be called an administrator, because I don't think that's something that's complimentary to me. And I was looking at the dean when I said that, and she said, "Do you know who you're talking to?" An administrator. Because what I was concerned about is how those labels, those terms and identifications constricted and restricted my potentials as a creative person. That's my own notion of identity. But I think, to go back to something you said, I'm not sure this notion of joy is so, it can be so liberated from the context or the environment that you suggest. However, I think when we go to a sports event like a basketball game or a football game, people sit in that audience from all kinds of backgrounds, and they celebrate the achievement of that individual. For them, it's vicarious. It's their achievement if it's his or her achievement. And it's interesting to watch this joy thing when you see a football player or a basketball player make just an exceptional save or a field goal or a touchdown, and the brother dances all over the field. But you'll see a white player run and make a touchdown and keep on going. Brother be dancing, flipping, doing somersaults and making faces. There's an expression of achievement that I think we should look at a little bit. You see it in basketball when someone jumps higher than humanly possible, or makes a shot like Curry makes a shot from one end of the court to the other, and people just go crazy. They share in that exceptional human achievement, and there's a shared joy with it. And Curry doesn't make a lot of dancing, he's kind of reserved. But you know, it's interesting in the way that space is a collective space. That joy is given permission regardless of where you come from. In other contexts, I think it's kind of questionable. And I think when you think about festivals and tents and religious revivals, you have to think about that inner city basketball court too. You know, what happens in that space, you know, with a basket that's attached and a ball that may not be a basketball, you know, but the opportunity to create an existential release from the environment is very important.
I've been thinking about, listening to everyone's comments, this question of if there is anything that is particular or that kind of rises to the top as being particular about joy as experienced, expressed, demonstrated in the Black experience. And the thing that kind of comes to mind, immediately at least, is that there is value in the collective celebration. There's value in the relational in a way that in our kind of traditional understandings and the preferred narrative of the West, we celebrate the individual genius, right? We celebrate the imagined Horatio Alger's story of bootstrapping and coming up the chain of things. We know that is not factually correct, right? But it is celebrated. And we celebrate the relational. We have been talking in AADHum other things, Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, right? And the joy that is clearly been exhibited around that is collective. But speaking about it in greater depth, like there's been the celebration of the science of it, there's been the celebration of all those wonderfully beautiful Black women being strong and unapologetic. None of those things, however, for me seem radical, partly because I'm undergrad at MIT, Black genius scientific is my norm. Strong Black women, I don't know, is a Giving Tuesday or Wednesday. That's my norm. But the sense that there's this relational component that gets kind of diseased in the West, right? Where people can disagree. You see the disagreements that happen between Okoye and Nakia. One is like, I'm gonna save my country. One is like, I'm gonna support and stay with my country. And they can respect that and keep moving. Or when T'Challa goes back to the ancestors the second time, right? He's like, y'all was wrong. You left that baby there in Oakland with nobody. All y'all was wrong and you should know y'all was wrong. And you were wrong and I'm gonna correct it, but I'm not severing my ties to my family, right? The relational, it persists. And so I think the celebration of the relational is part of how I see this notion of something that is qualitatively different, not necessarily in that it doesn't exist elsewhere, but how it is explicitly celebrated. However, for the introvert, that becomes a challenge. Because I think one of the things that Curly was unpacking and touching upon was that sometimes the collective comes with a condition of conformity. And if you don't do well with conformity, where does that leave you, right? And so thinking, it can leave you insane. It can leave you searching for a new tribe, right? And so thinking about the collective and the relational and the individual, I think that when I think about what I want to see more, right, is when I think about Black joy and celebration in digital spaces, it is almost always with the collective, right? It is Black men smile, which is lovely, right? Hashtag amen. But it is outward. I don't know how the digital works when it comes to the more internal, right? And so I think that for me is a lingering question. What do we do with the individual when we don't want it to be this kind of deformed and diseased celebration of individual ego and genius, right? Recognition that we're always at all times connected, and yet the individual can experience something that's qualitatively different and not necessarily accepted by the collective and still be cool, wonderful, great, and joyous.
Well, digital can provide, media can provide access and alternatives that may not exist in the individual's immediate network. So I think that's very positive. When you talk about Black Panther, it's an interesting kind of narrative in that this is a superhero that does not save the world. It actually is trying to prevent colonialism from continuing. So it's a different kind of, it's a relative notion, a relative story. So it's interesting in how that's discussed. But my point is that I think that digital platform and information can actually provide connections for individuals that are looking for a shared kind of joy. There's a group in Philadelphia called the Brothers Network, and they do a lot of this communication online and by media. And it's about loving as a group of men, loving each other and loving, caring for young men, how to raise young men. So the platform primarily is through digital media. So it could be, I think the biggest potential is collecting information so that there could be alternatives to the notion of joy.
And I'll say quickly in closing that I want us all to think about joy as methodology, as we sort of leave here to our respective disciplinary or interdisciplinary spaces, homes on campus. Beyond the sort of cliche about finding joy in one's work, which is essentially important, right? beyond finding joy or in one's work, enjoying one's work, what does it mean to do joy? What does it mean for joy to fundamentally inform, infuse, animate the work that you do as a rigorous method? And that's something that I'm trying to think through and trying to instrumentalize in my work. Again, some joy, I want to keep emphasizing that there is a joy that is perhaps unspeakable, unknowable, unharnessable, that escapes and exceeds me. But the joy that I can snatch and hold and thrust into a book for you all to read, I'm thinking about the ways in which that can be operationalized, in which the sentence can be, I talked about wanting to sort of emanate joy, but the sentence can actually be constructed in a way to optimize the joyful experience of the reader. The chapter can be organized so to optimize the joyful experience, so that form becomes content, right? So that the form of the text mirrors, intensifies the joyful content of the text. And this, for me, is a critical intervention. It's about Black joy, like multiplying the Black joy in the world. And anyone, for the record, I think Black joy can benefit others. It's a fundamentally, the joy that I want to produce in my text is a fundamentally Black joy, but all can be enlarged and enriched and enhanced by it. So I just want everyone to think about joy as method and methodology.
If I could just to get back to the question that you actually asked about disciplinarity. I think the challenge that I find, at least, with disciplinarity is that I'm a polyglot, right? I have degrees in 4 different things. And it means that I think at its best, I get to use the tools from a variety of different disciplines. I think I am a polyglot in part because I've also seen the limitations of each of those disciplines, moving through them and being like, okay, that gives me something, but that's not enough. This gives me something, but I also need something else. And so when I think about how we conceptualize Black joy, how we study joy, the fact that we insist upon joy as something to be studied, which can be revolutionary and radical in and of itself, I think there are values in disciplines, right? You know, I'm saying to the graduate students often that you're in a discipline to be disciplined, right? Like it teaches you certain things, but I think one of the things that we try to stress in AADHum is that you begin with a question, right? That's where good, solid, robust research begins. It begins with a question. You have an interest, but then you formulate a question. And so I think what is wonderful about interdisciplinarity is that you say, how many ways could I approach this question? What can I draw from my toolkit that is going to help me answer this question best? And that, for me, is where the work begins, right? Not with, how do I contribute to the discipline? I think that if I do the work well, it should contribute to, I think that's the outcome, but not necessarily the aim. For me, the aim is, how do I grapple with this question, and then what are the tools? Maybe I have those in my toolkits. Maybe I need to work collaboratively to talk with some people and to get some ideas from people, because I ain't got all the tools. I don't know all the things. And so I think that both interdisciplinarity and the digital do open up, and they have this affordance of giving us the opportunity to be able to round out and make more robust the kind of work and the kind of research that we do, with the recognition that all of our tools in disciplines are necessarily limited. They can't do everything. And so it gives us a greater, not just platform, but a toolkit, a way or ways of being able to approach things.
And can make the material of the work more readable.
Yes.
In some ways, because just because you're the author and the reader doesn't mean that the audience is able to read the material in the way that you are expressing it. Because often as an author, you're hearing that voice.
Yes.
And you think you're the reader, and actually you're not the reader, you're just the author of it. And it takes that reader to complete that process. And the reader becomes author as well. We do this with exhibitions all the time. You know, the artist is an author, as a curator we become authors, and then the final authorship is the audience, completing that process. So we surrendered authorship of the work. So being involved with different disciplines allows you to perhaps even broaden and be even more successful, I believe, in providing access to the reader.
And generative in the ways that things can be produced. My mama is not going to want to read my article.
Exactly.
I don't want to read my article, let's be clear, right?
But you write it for somebody.
I'm writing that for something and for someone, but I think that there are different ways that we can produce and manifest all of these different methodologies and theories that we engage in that transcend the way that we are disciplined to think that we should.
I want to give us a little bit of time for folks here to ask questions. We have about 10 minutes where we can get some questions from the audience. If anyone has a question, project. Oh, you know what? We actually have a microphone. Thanks, Stephanie.
Who had a?
Yeah. So earlier it was mentioned that, and I do apologize. I did not hear your name at the very start of the talk. All that to say, I remember you had mentioned that there's a class element to joy, and you were mentioning a story about your wife, and so I was just a little uncomfortable, and I wanted to address that feeling of discomfort because I think that, particularly in the academy, and this is not necessarily toward you, but particularly in the academy, when I hear folks talk about the nuance of Black expression, sometimes there's a way in which I think working class Black expressions of happiness or maybe even joy can be seen as like not enough. And so and I'm not saying you were doing that, I'm saying it's something I have to deal with, but my question here is that how can we embrace maybe some of the ways in which there is class stratification, but that class stratification can be okay in the expression of multiple joys?
That's interesting. In my particular case, what I was describing is that because of the way I was raised, my experience of joy was to have an object and space between each object, and not to have clutter. Things are organized. I was raised, that was joyful for me, and it gives me anxiety when things are a mess and things are stacked on top of each other and there appears to be no order.
Oh, the tensions.
Well, for example, there was a researcher, scholar who came to my house to interview us as a couple. And I said, if you really want to know what we're like, I want you to go into the bedroom and look at her closet, then go in the other bedroom and look at my closet. I have a different closet, but I don't have a different bedroom, but a different closet. And she came out and says, I can see it. So my point is that it produced anxiety with me because of my upbringing, but for her, it provided a whole different purpose for her. So what I meant by class is having experience of lack. And I think lack impoverishes us. And it doesn't mean just lack financially. It can be lack in cultural experience. It can be lack in many different ways. And that's what I was trying to touch on.
If I could just jump like 2 seconds, I really don't even need it. All I'm gonna say is like, I think that is that's what I'm pushing back against. Like, I don't think that lack impoverishes us. I think me having to eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with my mother made me happy. Like, I'm not saying that like being in poverty makes you happy. I'm saying that there can be a joy in lack.
And that Black people are an extraordinarily resourceful, creative people, and I agree with you, and I hear what you're saying. I'm thinking about the ways in which working class Black joy is sometimes pathologized. We use the terms sort of ghetto or sometimes ratchet to describe, pejoratively, because sometimes some people have embraced those as positive, to describe the uproar of loud Black laughter that is associated with the Black working class, or the sort of, I'm thinking about my grandfather's apartment and how much it was cluttered with all of this sort of wonderful Black memorabilia that some people might have found aesthetically displeasing, but that was sort of this wonderfully curated, in my mind, right, collection of narrative of Black life. So we have to think through, I'm interested in thinking through how we pathologize Black joy, particularly working class Black joy, but Black joy more broadly.
So if I could contextualize a bit, because I don't think that that's what I heard with Professor Houghton's statement. Right.
Exclusively.
Right. But I think we also just need to contextualize that what Professor Houghton was saying was that, one, he is working class, right? So it wasn't, he is working class, and he, from what I heard, was talking about the sense of anxiety that led to a particular demonstration of things, right? And so it wasn't the demonstration, it was not the clutter, right? The clutter creates anxiety for him, but he was talking about the anxiety that his wife felt, right? And so it wasn't something that came from a place of joy. It wasn't something that having all the things was something that came from a positive place from her. It came from a place of anxiety. And so he was talking about the anxiety that created a particular kind of demonstration, not talking about the demonstration itself, if that makes sense.
That's helpful.
It's something
Right.
that I've concluded some time ago in my work and what I do is when I listen to people and when people talk, is that I think we are the creations of our experience, especially our childhood experience. And I think we act it out in many different ways throughout our entire life. Our choices, your choice of being here at this moment, and your choice that you make as a professional, your choice of expression, I think if you unpack that, you will find that it has a reaction or a relationship to your childhood experience, either by design or by accident. I'm totally convinced of that. It is the child that has produced you.
Oh, there's a question over
There
there.
was, yeah, I want to make sure they get to that.
As always, I want to say thanks for your time and your thoughts. I am that West Indian, parents born in Jamaica. I was born here. I've always been outside of the loop. And one of the reasons I'm here is still trying to understand what it means to really be Black in America. And so when I hear Black joy, the way I always feel or understand it is it always comes from a place of oppression, resistance, meaning that we're always celebrating how far we've come. Can you imagine? And I even do it myself. I think of it, oh, how far I've come. You know, a kid who could have been born in Jamaica and looking to figure out how to get to the US, but I was lucky enough to be born here and build something for both my family and friends. So I was just curious, how do you see that difference of really Black joy not being tied to the struggle? Because that's how I see it. When we celebrate, it's really always tied to the struggle.
Can I speak to that for a minute? I was at a panel discussion about 3 weeks ago for an exhibition of African women artists. And there was a woman from Rwanda, and most of her work had to do with the genocide in Rwanda. But she spoke about going home. She's finishing her, I think, graduate studies at RISD. She goes home and she begins to learn how to use calf dung to make artwork. And what she did is gone back home and found the women who were teaching how to use this dung, both in their houses and as decorative. Now the audience was a little bothered that we were talking about shit, but you know, we talked about Christophily and you know, the elephant dung and all this, and I thought it was amazing. I mean, the way she was talking about trying to bring back this body of material and this knowledge, and I talked about the art of Africans that are in America and West Indians creating a different kind of hybrid artwork. It's not just African American, but it has a Caribbean or an African element. She said something that was really striking. She says, when I go home to Rwanda, I'm myself. When I come back to the US and I go to RISD and I walk in that classroom, I am made Black. I thought this was really powerful, that her true self has to be modulated because she walks in a space in North America. So I think the West Indian has had to negotiate all kinds of territory that has not been really discussed or documented very well. That territory of assumption of one identity, actually coming from a different cultural identity and moving through those spaces. It's an amazing kind of thing that should be spoken about more and documented more. But it's about hybrid and about movement and about survival.
When I think about that notion of joy as being relative to struggle, right? When I think about my own work, I think in shorthand, people will say I study Black love. I never say that I study Black love, ever. I study relationships, and I study loving from the experience of Black people. The reason that I study relationships and loving, partly as a sociologist, there's so much that studies challenges and problems when it comes to the experiences of Black people. But for me, I think at the heart of it is that I want to understand how things work, right? And my understanding of how things work is that there's always, in its fullness, there is joy and there is sorrow, there is celebration and there is mourning. And if I want to understand how something works, I have to understand all of that, right? And so in sociology, we study the Black family, right? Which means Black families that have broken apart or not formed via marriage, right? That's what we mean when we say Black family, because there are very few, i.e. almost none, studies of couples who happen to be Black, right? Of intact families, though all families are families and thus intact. But in studying relationships and couples, what I get to do is to make an argument about the fact that there's more than problem that we can study, right? Because it's not about proving what Black folks and Black families are. It's about how do we understand how something works, which is a very distinct and different way of thinking about how we can understand Black people. How do things work, right? In which case it stops being relative to the things that happen to us. It's how things have happened and how we deal with those things and how we don't deal with those things. It's not always about the struggle. And so that requires us, though, to ask different kinds of questions. And so for me, the way of dealing with that, always having to define myself by struggle, is that I ask questions that don't start there.
And I think both our analytic of Black joy and our experience of Black joy let me rephrase that. My analytic around Black joy, my experience of Black joy doesn't demand purity, right? So I often experience joy alongside anxiety, right? Absolutely, positively. And in fact, that's my standard default mode in the world. But similarly, my analytic of Black joy, right, takes into account what you're describing, the joy mobilized in the midst of struggle, the joy that sort of perhaps is relative to experiences of oppression, alongside the sort of originary, ontological, creative joy. They're both happening at once in me, and I wouldn't want to sort of tout an analytic that foregrounds the other at the expense of recognizing the one, or vice versa.
And joy can be both perhaps universal and particular at the same time. In my case, I think of joy as a very private experience. I spend time in the studio, and I don't give anyone permission to come into the space. And it's a space where certain things could happen with the making of a work of art. I could express myself in a certain way with the materials that can create. Doesn't happen all the time, but there could be sometimes a gesture or a moment where I actually capture the emotion or the sensibility that I have present, and it creates a profound sense of joy. Something I don't talk about very much, doesn't happen often, because I don't have a chance to do that often. But you get a warm wash over your brain, I'll get goosebumps, and something has happened. Something has happened in that private moment. And I'm not motivated to share that with anybody. It's not selfish, it's just that I think it has a lot to do with my own psychology and emotions and this act of creativity. And I think that is a liberating and the freest moment that I have. And then I leave my studio and come back into my home, and I have 2 dogs and 4 grandchildren and all kinds of other things that bring joy to me, but not a singular joyful moment. And I like to keep that in reserve. And I imagine as authors and writers, you have it as well.
I saw that, quickly there was, we can maybe get to questions.
Is it okay if I just project?
Could you use the mic because we're on live stream? Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for your comments. It was a really interesting panel. My question is for Dr. Bickerstaff. What you talked about this label of Black joy and also going to the range of human experiences. And I wanted to ask you to expand on some of the points that you were just making about your own research on Black people in relationships and Black couples, to ask how do you navigate the interpretive authority around emotion and what they're describing. And so, for example, what I'm hearing about just this term of Black joy and how we think about it, I'm thinking about if I were to repost something of someone else's experience and label it, hashtag it Black joy, that's my own interpretive authority on it. And so I wanted to ask about specifically your experience with doing interviews. How do you navigate your own interpretive authority and what people are describing in terms of the range of their emotions and experiences?
So as a qualitative researcher, I try to balance a number of things. I want what my interviewees say to come across as kind of unfiltered as possible on the page. And so I often will include my question and what they say, not simply their words out of context, so we understand where it's coming from and what they're responding to. But I think that my interpretive authority is that it comes in not because I can tell, what it is that they felt. I can't do that, right? They say that they felt X, and I can unpack some of the things that happen that people can't see and people didn't hear, right? The pause in their voice, the lowering or heightening of their volume, if they catch as they begin to speak, if there are tears, all of those things. And so I try to give the reader, right, some access to the way that things unfolded. However, my work is also interpretive. So in being interpretive, it means that it is an interpretation, right? There are other sociologists, other writers who write about relationships, and I can read it and come away with something radically different, right? That is a big part of where my research has kind of been most generative. I can read something and be like, oh, so there's some cultural context in your interpretation that is missing, right? Partly because so few Black couples get interviewed. And so what I try to do is be as explicit as possible about where my interpretations are coming from, right? What are the things that I am drawing upon? And also, how is it that this interpretation was developed? It is still an interpretation, and only that.
I think we are at time, and I know that there were still questions lingering, so I hope our panel is open if people wanted to come and ask questions as well after. But I want to thank you all so much for coming. I want to thank our panel once again so much for the conversation and so much for sharing their time with us. Let's thank them. And I will invite you